Here we go. Welcome to the Anchor team. I asked Michael Hitchborn if I could address this particular topic this evening. And once I discovered the work of this evening's guest, some things became very clear to me. I say this because I've always wrestled with the feminist movement. Like many people, I felt the first wave of feminism was a reasonable commitment for women to gain the right to vote. The so-called second and third waves from, say, Gloria Steinem on seemed to go off the rails a little bit. There was this palpable animosity there. But I discovered by research and reading the work of our guest tonight, Dr. Carrie Gress, my initial impression of early feminism as a reasonable push towards equal rights and voting was wrong. First wave feminism was not about the right to vote. It was about, to state it as clearly as I can, beginning the process of convincing women that they were victims of male patriarchy. And the ultimate goal, in my opinion, was destruction of marriage and family. Second and third wave feminism came in, as we will discuss tonight. A strong argument can be made that it's Marxist, with a full-on embrace of critical theory. This is not an exaggeration. Our guest tonight has done meticulous academic research utilizing original source materials. My hope is you do a few things after tonight's Anchor team. First of all, be interested enough to educate yourself. Secondly, begin this process by purchasing Dr. Gress's book, The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. And please pass this video along to friends and family and post on any social media presence that you may have. I will say tonight's discussion will prove to be at the very least eye-opening. And if you're like me, it'll be shocking. With that, let's begin. Dr. Carrie Gress, welcome and thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, Jim.
You got it. Well, listen, now is the part where I kind of embarrass you. So I'm going to go through a abbreviated version of Dr. Gress's and Carrie, your CV here. So Dr. Carrie Gress is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a scholar at the Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University of America. She earned her doctorate in philosophy from the Catholic University of America as the founder and co-editor at the online women's magazine and marketplace Theology of Home. Carrie has written numerous publications and is a frequent guest on radio and television. I can attest to that. I've seen about probably 15 hours of her. She's the author of 10 books, including The Marian Option, The Anti-Mary Exposed, and The Anti-Mary Exposed. She co-authored Theology of Home 1, 2, and 3 with Noelle Marin. Her latest book, The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. Carrie is a married, homeschooling mother of 5 and lives in Virginia. Carrie, if we could start, can you, by doing your best, can you give us a brief overview of feminism's origin, starting with the French Revolution, and then get right to Seneca Falls and all the good stuff that comes with that, the Women's Bible and all that?
Yeah. So, this research was something that really astounded me because when I first started looking at it, I'd already written this book called The Anti-Mary Exposed, and I went back to the 1960s in that book, and I didn't go back any earlier because, like you, I had been told that the first wave feminism was good. And so when it was time for me to write the second book, and this book on women, this book really was meant to focus on a non-Catholic audience. I had so many people say, can you help? I have Protestant friends that I can't give you my book to, and I have, secular friends and people that are atheists, and can you write a book that can be addressed to them? So we got rolling with the publisher and, all those things. And I thought, let me just go back and look at first wave feminism and just make sure maybe I'll find some nice quotes from it that I can use elsewhere. But I needed to just sort of scratch this itch. And so I went back to first wave feminism, and I was just astounded at what I found because I didn't expect to find negative things at all. In fact, I found so many problems with it that really became sort of the backbone of the book. And as you mentioned, it starts with the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, of course, was focused on this idea of how do we get rid of tradition and faith and family? How do we sort of reconstruct this vision, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau wanted, where, we kind of create these, radical individuals and, we get rid of the family and we use the ideas of Kant. And so that was where I started. And then certainly Mary Wollstonecraft is part of that whole vision. And then I moved on to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And from there, you get into spiritualism. And this was the most astounding part of it to me, was just how much um, the occult played into this, how much the seances, I mean, even the idea of the spirit table, all of these kinds of things were built into this. And, Jim, I'm sure you've sort of seen some of this in my book, and seen the issues that come up, and just the seances that, people are involved in. And so that's happening. And that's really very much pushed under the carpet with regard to the first wave feminism. So that was fascinating to find.
The spirit table in the Smithsonian right now, right?
Yeah, it's now in the Smithsonian. That's exactly right. So we're still honoring this table, which is where the idea for the Seneca Falls Convention came from, which is sort of considered the footprint of feminism. It's kind of that cornerstone of it. So that happens with really Elizabeth Cady Stanton asking the spirits to give her ideas, and that's where it comes from. So later, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's reputation is actually destroyed because of the fact that she gets involved with this woman named Victoria Woodhull, who was a medium. And Victoria actually ran for president. She was this really radical woman from this crazy background. Her father was basically they call him a snake oil salesman now, but he was wanted in all these states for basically, cheating people out of things. He prostituted his daughters. It's just an incredible mess, this family. And so Victoria ends up being this huge proponent of free love. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are sort of at a loss, because the other women's group is getting a lot more attention. And so they're like, well, how can we drum up some attention? They're like, Victoria Woodhull, why don't we have her come speak? Because everybody listens to Victoria Woodhull. She just was so famous, and I think probably was very enigmatic, and just this very unusual woman. And so she speaks at this women's event and starts talking about free love, and creates this huge scandal, getting rid of monogamy and all of that. And so that was really, it ended up leading to a greater scandal beyond that. But that was really what put the nail in the coffin for Elizabeth Cady Stanton's reputation. She'd also written this book called The Women's Bible, which was focused on trying to read through scripture. And if you pick, you can still buy it today, but if you look at it, you can really tell that she is trying to undermine Christianity, but she does it in a way that feels like the angry teenage girl, like just kind of bashing anytime men are mentioned. Anyway, so it's all of those things that really led to her disgrace. And, led for 20 years, I think the vote didn't happen. It probably could have happened at the time when she was promoting the suffrage movement, but because of all these scandals, it ended up being delayed until 1919, I think, at least another 20 years later after her death.
If I could too, when this part killed me. It was in your book. When they first tried to get the suffrage vote, they couldn't get women on board. But the best part was, if I remember correctly, they had a vote and they made sure women couldn't vote because they weren't on board with it. Would you mind going into that? This totally freaked me out.
I don't think I actually did cover that so much, but that was the amazing thing, was just the fact that this was the vote was really men. And it's interesting too to even see there were 3 states that apparently could vote shortly around the time that the 19th Amendment happened, and there were certain people that were very much against it as well. There was one woman who was this radical anarchist, and she's definitely not in the book. She's later research that I did, a woman named Emma Goldman, who her ideas actually echo Mary Wollstonecraft's dramatically, because she has both of them have this idea that we don't know what women can be because we've been constrained by laws and tradition. And Emma Goldberg thought that we needed to get rid of everything and have anarchy, because from that would be created some kind of order and, this beautiful beauty of creativity. But she was one of the many that said, women shouldn't have the vote. She went against all the other what we would call feminists of the era. This is around 1910. And so they shouldn't have it because they're just as, the argument was that women would purify the vote, that we would end up making politics clean by, the compassion and the gentleness of womanhood. And her whole argument was that's not going to happen, especially because at the time you had so many prostitutes in New York City. After the Civil War, prostitution was rampant. She's, and her argument was, if women are willing to sell their bodies, they're certainly going to be willing to sell their vote. And she, looked at these other states. So anyway, it was such a tumultuous time. And I think this was one of the remarkable things that I really gleaned from this era. I had done my dissertation on human rights. And so I knew this period well philosophically, but I didn't know it so well socially. And so I was kind of amazed at just the tremendous amount of tumult that was going on because of the Civil War. You've got the suffrage movement. The suffrage movement's taking a lot of its cues from the temperance movement. You've got, just the mayhem from all the men who have just died in the Civil War and trying to rebuild the culture. And then throw on top of it this spiritualist movement, where everybody's trying seances to reach the dead, whether it's dead children or dead husbands.
Right. It was after the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
All these people died, and children at that period of time, died from diseases, and there's a lot of heartbreak.
A lot of heartbreak, and a lot of people who, you also have to remember electricity had just come online. People are getting electricity. And so there's this sense that, and this is kind of how the spiritualists sold themselves. It was like electricity, but it's sort of, you're going directly to heaven and to the dead instead of just getting light in your house. So it was a really crazy time period. So I think that, any effort to look back at the first wave and say, and it just gets worse. I mean, this is the other thing. I've been doing a ton of research on the 1910 period right now, which is why I ran across Emma Goldberg. There's another woman named Charlotte Perkins Gilman who is fascinating because she wrote the book called Her Island, which became Wonder Woman. So all the Wonder Woman tales we know come from this text. It's a novel, and she describes these three men that come across this island where it's an area where it's only women that live there, and have only been women for 1,000 years. And of course, it's incredibly idyllic. And, they raise, it's crazy. But in any event, these are the ideas that are going on in the culture at this time, is that if you don't have men, you won't have any of the problems. You won't have the competition. You won't have women who are, pregnant repeatedly. You won't have, you can use birth control. All these kinds of ideas are really percolating at that period. And it's incredibly messy, but also incredibly idealistic in terms of what their vision was that they could create if they could just deal with men. But the way in which they wanted to deal with it was by making women more like men. So that's, I think, the big irony of feminism, is this idea of we want to get rid of the patriarchy, we want to get rid of men. We also want to get rid of motherhood. But in order to do all of that, we have to make women more like men.
Right. Fair enough. If I could take these, great overview, by the way, if I could take these ideas, and if you could talk a little bit specifically about who were the people that started that newsletter, and they were basically sleeping with these business titans. And so, and I forget, was it Vanderbilt? Was that who it was?
Cornelius Vanderbilt. So
okay, this is great. So Vanderbilt at the time, when the stock market was very volatile and it was going down, Vanderbilt was killing it, right? All of a sudden, they're going, well, how did you know to short this stock at that time? And for those at home, that means if you think a stock's going to go down, you short it, and it's a process by which you can make money if the stock goes down. And he was nailing it, right? And so would you go into that a little bit? Because I really want to take your point and take it.
Yeah, so Victoria Woodhull and her sister Tennessee Claflin are the two women whom I mentioned already. Their father was the snake oil salesman.
Yeah.
Tenny, as she was known, she was a prostitute, and she was the prostitute mistress of Cornelius Vanderbilt's. But he used both of them as mediums to contact the spirits so that he could get suggestions about his investments. And he did so well that he set them up with their own firm. So these two have the first women who have an investment firm. And so then they create this newsletter. And that was really how they stirred up all this controversy, was because they were able to publish whatever they wanted to in this newsletter. And that's, again, where Victoria Woodhull goes into running for president. Anyway, it's just amazing what they're able to do because of this connection with the Vanderbilt family. And actually, even remarkably, I think it was, I know it was Gloria Steinem who actually had, I think it was a letter, or it must have been a letter from Victoria Woodhull that she kept in her office at Ms. Magazine. Like, she was so entranced and enthralled by these two women, but disappointed because eventually, the money runs out and their attractiveness runs out. And they ended up both settling, I think, with very wealthy English gentlemen, so that they had titles and, all those things. But yeah, they're incredibly colorful, and, kind of amazing that most people don't know or have heard of them, because they're such a colorful chapter of the first wave movement.
Sure. And I have to tie this in, and we were discussing this before the show a little bit. So what got me about that was I'm reading your book, and I go, wait a minute, Vanderbilt, right? And I'm like, huh. So here's my point. So Vanderbilt was one of the guys, if I'm not mistaken, the creature from Jekyll Island. He was at Jekyll Island to start the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, why is that relevant? The founding fathers were really had issued many admonitions about staying away from a federal national bank, right? They really did. Why? Because they knew the malfeasance that could come from using things like tax bases to leverage and get the United States into trouble. And they were really astute students of history, and particularly economic history, and they knew that this was bad, and they fought against it tooth and nail. Well, sure enough, right around, I think it was 1914, Vanderbilt was one of the guys. Now, what does this all mean? The point is that if you destroy the family and you tell people that you tell women in particular that they are victims of the male patriarchy and they've been held down, and you really need to find your best self out there in the world in the form of a career and getting a paycheck. Well, what does that do? Mm-hmm. Number one, it drives wages down. Now we have half the population that was on, and boom, next thing you know, we're driving wages down. Point number two, and this is probably the biggest one, and these guys who started the Federal Reserve, they love low wages. Let me tell you, that's their margins, right? And the second thing was, it increases the tax base. And why is that relevant? Because and this is something the founding fathers had warned against, because if you have an increased tax base like that, then you can have a central bank of which you can borrow. And who gets special treatment at the lending windows even to this day? And all of those guys, and they ran this through Congress Christmas Eve, December 24th, when everyone was out of town. But the point I'm trying to make is
What year was that?
Oh, sorry. I was afraid you were going to ask me that. I'm going to take a shot at this.
Yeah, how about a decade? What decade was it?
Oh, I want to say 1914. That's going to be my.
Oh, wow, that early. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, and so and this all, and the chronology of this makes sort of sense, because even if it wasn't, even if they were running their newsletter 20 years before, it still makes sense. And I find this fascinating because when you really look at it, and the only guy I can think of that may possibly be an exception is Elon Musk, but since the beginning of time, the Gilded Age, and I mean anyone who really had quite a bit of wealth, they have this God complex, and they know that they can reconcile. Rockefeller is a perfect example. I mean, that guy was, and Ford and all these other guys. They just knew that they knew better, and they want to recreate the world in their image.
Yeah. Well, and the amazing thing is too, I mean, given that timeline, is just how much socialism was influencing the women's movement. One of the very first journals that talked about birth control was actually named Lucifer Magazine. That's what it's called. And I think it ended up changing its name eventually to something more innocuous, like the Birth Control Weekly or something, something to that effect. But that was all run by socialists, and it was the socialists who were really stirring up this discontent in women, saying, we've got to get to the heart of women and get them to stop thinking that they are happy at home. So that this is starting in like the 1880s, 1890s. This is all, brewing already. And it's just building off of the women's revolution idea. Because at that point, nobody was really calling themselves feminism. I think that's, came later, roughly more in the 1900s.
Right.
But then you move to the 1900s, and it's, this wild relationship develops between the feminists who are all, especially this group in Greenwich Village, New York, in the 1910s, who this Emma Goldman I mentioned is part of. There's a whole book called Hotbed that I've discovered that talks about this. All these women are part of this group called heterodoxy. And the only requirement to be in this women's club was that you were heterodox in your beliefs. And they were the ones, and the woman that I mentioned that wrote the Wonder Woman novel, she was a huge member of this. And this group of women ended up really trying to help define what feminism meant. But in the meantime, you got the Marxists moving in, and the communists from Russia are trying to get a foothold in the United States. And they initially didn't like the feminists because they were too bourgeois, and the feminists didn't like them because they thought they were too political and violent. And then this communists actually realized, like, wait a minute, all these women are very angry. Like, we can use this anger for our own purposes. And the woman, I think her last name is Colonna. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I think that was it. But she's also the woman that founded the International Women's Day that we now celebrate every March. You know, it's a communist event, basically to promote women as part of this communist revolution. It's pandering to them. And they knew exactly that that's what they were doing, was trying to pander to women so that they would become better workers for the party. They knew their emotions were easily manipulatable. And so they ended up glomming on to the feminists. And you see this in, I think, the early 1940s with Bella Dodd. It must have been later 1940s, I want to say. Yes. Because it wasn't during the war. I want to say it was like 48, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think Paul Kanger's book, what he did with Mary Nichols, I think. Yeah. I believe you're right. Please continue.
So there was a lot that I got from that book, but there was one piece that I was able to connect with Betty Friedan, because this group, Congress for American Women, that again was set up by the Soviets to try and emotionally manipulate women. I mean, this was their stated goal. Bella Dodd ended up writing about this in one of her books later on, was that they knew women were manipulatable, and they wanted to show the Soviets as this, like, the shining hill of womanhood, because all the children were raised by somebody else and the women were just workers and they could get abortions. All of this was the real vision that they were promoting. And it ended up being shut down before this Congress for American Women ended up being shut down by the House Committee for Un-American Activities. But you had women like Betty Friedan involved in this. And so it was really fascinating to then read The Feminine Mystique and see exactly what she's doing. It's all angles. It's all it's all trying to get women out of the home and make them workers, but in a very psychologically nuanced and careful way. It's really phenomenal.
Would it be fair to say that Betty Friedan also used Saul Alinsky tactics? Because because I think a lot of people who were paying attention were going, wait a minute, she's an interesting character as well, because if I'm not mistaken, she was actually full of it. She kind of brought up in this world, like saying, like, she just watched her mother go through this horrendous life, and she lived a fairly privileged background, and she claims that this sort of occurred to her when she got older, but she was a avowed Marxist, like as early as
early. Like high school, high school,
right?
Like senior year of high school, much more radicalized in college. Yeah. And she wrote articles, and this was actually the amazing thing to find, was a book that was written by a friend of hers called Betty Friedan and the Making of the Feminine Mystique, who saw her. Daniel Horowitz is his name. He saw her at UCLA. And actually, there's a friend of mine that took this class with Betty Friedan. But he was watching one of her classes, and he noticed that she was using Saul Alinsky tactics with these young students.
Yeah.
So he started paying attention to Friedan, and of course she's like, no, I was just a housewife. She's denying all of it.
Right.
So he finally starts digging and realizes, and the reason, his real motivation for writing this book was to show that here's this woman who was able to navigate around McCarthy, because she was still a communist, but she was clever enough that she could still get around McCarthyism and survive and flourish, as compared to all of the other people that had their careers destroyed by McCarthyism. But she was able to navigate around it and still use those tactics. So he approached her with this idea of, like, this is what I want to write about. It's so genius that you were able to do this. And she says to him, my documents are sealed until 2035. And if you try to get anything from me, then I will, sick my lawyers on you, basically. Well, there was enough that he could find that was not closed source material that he was still able to write this book. So you can imagine that in 2035, I will probably be busy in her archives reading all the things that she's been hiding for all these years. But the book is incredibly compelling and talks a lot about how she was very much a Marxist, and her whole goal was to get women out of the home and working. And she was incredibly subtle and just really successful at it in ways that, she really poked in those areas where women are very susceptible. That fear of missing out, that idea that if you're at home, you're what she called the comfortable concentration camp. This is what she called it.
Right. That was the term.
Yeah. So that's what she's calling the home. And also just this sense of you're really missing out because the men are out there having a great time. And here you are, changing diapers kind of thing. So yeah, it's really incredible, the kind of manipulation and how deep the manipulation is in her work, because and how much people have taken it on, both liberals and conservative women. I mean, it's hard to find the dividing line now, because so many women have decided that, of course, our careers are the most important thing. And, that's the really horrific reality, is how successful she was in her job.
Right. You just reminded me of something, if you wouldn't mind going into this a little bit. One of the things I found most pronounced about your book was the level of heartbreak left in the wake of these people. I mean, right from the beginning. And what I mean to say is that the premise was they had to, I would say they had to destroy the family by instituting the concept and glorifying sex without responsibility. Fair enough? Is that a fair statement, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that these are broken women who, rather than saying the brokenness is not, the brokenness is because we have traditions and laws. The brokenness is not because people violated those. That's the confusion. And that's the thing that I found across the board. Everybody from Mary Wollstonecraft, who had this horrible family, awful father,
You can go into that a little bit because it's very compelling.
Yeah. So she's kind of a remarkable figure, because people really hold her up as sort of the first feminist. Of course, again, that word wasn't being used, but promoter of this women's revolution. So she's raised by this awful father who's squanders his money, and they have to keep moving because the creditors are after him. And he's an alcoholic, and he abuses his wife. And so Mary is trying to protect her mother, and like sits in front of her door at night, when her father's out at the bars and gets drunk, and ends up making things worse, because the mother apparently she only cares about the firstborn son. And her mother's just this insipid character that, Mary's taking care of all the other children while the mother is just doting on the eldest son, and being, just completely submissive to the abusive father. And, the family dog gets hung. I mean, it's just this horrible story. Yeah.
At that part.
And yeah. And then
he was drunk and hung the family dog, right?
Something it happens, right? Yeah. It's just crazy. So she's a model. I mean, she's around all these families that are like this, where the women are really left holding the bag and the men are really awful. And so you can see it really also in the novels that she wrote. There was one of her novels that was published after she died. There was another one that was published before she died. But in both of them, she's really targeting marriage, and she's really making it very clear that she thinks marriage is the problem, that if we just had people that could have these emotional bonds with whomever they wanted to, that's really where, the flourishing of the family would come from. And again, this is the same message that you get from 100 years later with Emma Goldman and other feminists, but it's also from her husband. Wollstonecraft is married to this man named William Godwin, who, if you know the history of Marx, he was highly influential upon Marx. He had been a Protestant pastor and left being a pastor because he realized he was an atheist, and he thought marriage was a kind of slavery. So that's really where it starts, in terms of just the brokenness of women. And then, it just kind of goes through, if you go through all of the major players, there's something in them that is clearly very broken. Of course, the Woodhull sisters, the Claflin sisters, are incredibly broken from the very beginning, where they prostituted both for their sexuality, but also as mediums, sexually or spiritually. You've got Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's got her own issues. I mean, it's just on and on. And then it gets really bad when you get to the second wave, just incredibly deep and broken women. But this is the pattern is, and I think this is what is just so difficult and challenging about sin, is that it really blinds us. And especially if you've got people telling you that you are a victim, then it gives people the sense that the solution is to get rid of stuff, not to enforce things, not to, and that's been really the feminist movement is women suffer from pregnancy and from their husbands. Let's get rid of them. That's the ideal. I mean, that's really encapsulated by the man whom I think actually articulated feminism the best, which was Mary Wollstonecraft's son-in-law, whom she never met because she had died in childbirth, giving birth to her daughter, Mary Godwin, who ended up becoming Mary Godwin Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein.
Right, that was Wollstonecraft's daughter, right?
What's that?
Mary
Yes,
Shelley was
Wollstonecraft's daughter. Exactly. Yeah. So it's all in the book, but it's just really incredible how, all brokenness really begets brokenness, and it just is continued, further and further. Broken people break people, and this is the real tragedy: is that we know the church has the capacity to heal people, and this is what's really being rejected: is these means through which people can be healed. It's the church is labeled superstitious. Of course, the patriarchy becomes the worst possible thing, and of course, our church is a patriarchy. So, all of the elements of feminism are at their very root, including the occult, this idea of patriarchy, and then this idea that we can really just change the structure of society. All these things end up being very anti-Catholic on so many different levels, and again, therefore making it much more difficult for these women to find the real healing that they need and certainly deserve.
Yeah, it's a very interesting comment you make, because when you think about it, what's the ultimate patriarchy got?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And so, but it really is fascinating, this entire thing. And the reason I have all the string going up in my garage from what I cannot believe is how this all ties in.
Mm-hmm.
There's fundamental themes here, and they all seem to point to a destruction of the heavenly hierarchy. And what's the representation of that on earth? The family.
Yeah.
Family is the representation of, and you've got to get that. You've got to go after the family first, because to your point, even the socialists, they love it, right? Get the kids out of the house. Abortion has become a sacrament, right?
Yeah.
And we become, and effectively, the entire worldview is materialism.
Mm-hmm.
That's the worldview. And I find the whole thing really, it's all tied in. Even to this day, there's a certain candidate running for president. I'm going to mangle this quote, but it's what can be unburdened by what has been.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Am I close?
Yeah.
Right? All right. So let's look at that for a second. Let's not get involved with pesky things like empirical evidence. None of that. And so what I'm saying is, if you think about that statement, it's insane, right? It's like, I don't know about you, but I'd kind of like to know, what's the track record on your great idea? But no, the idea right now is the focus is on whatever victim group you throw yourself into, and then we have to deconstruct this whole thing.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that's just so astounding, is if you do look at the culture today, it really is that what owns everything is this idea of victimhood. If you can make people think that they are a victim, and if there's status in victimhood, then that goes a long way. And, this is, and I think even more fundamentally, women have been told that they're victims because they have the capacity to give birth, because they're mothers. And this is what they've been trying to wipe out. So if you look at the vehemence with which women fight for abortion, this is the vehemence with which women used to fight for their children. Like, this is the absolute mangling and manipulation that has happened on such a fundamental level. Like, this is fundamentally what they've done, is they've taken us from, the mama bear to now the woman who will fight like in crazy ways. I mean, all I have to do is look at any interview that it's being done at women's marches, or with, someone like Students for Life, all of those arguments that happen publicly. And the people that are arguing for them it's all motivated by emotion and this sense of fight and fierceness and ferocity, that there's an injustice here. And that's, I think, to me, one of the things that I probably will spend the rest of my life fascinated by is how do they get women to betray this most fundamental relationship between mother and child and twist it so deeply.
Wow, what a great question.
So
Yes.
yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I couldn't help it.
Yeah, no, that's
so
a fundamental question.
It's against the natural order. Every woman I know is fiercely protective of their children. How did we do this inversion?
Yes. And it's because we've told women that they're victims, and we've told them that their husbands are an obstacle to their happiness, and we've told them that their children will not make them happy. Those are the lies that we have bought into. And of course, then if you look at all the data, then you can see very clearly that feminism hasn't made women happy. In fact, the data shows that women are far less happy now than they were before feminism. So it's really just an incredible pack of lies that we have taken on, so deeply on such an emotional level.
To your point, I remember reading a study, I think about 2 years ago, coming from the Bureau of Economic Statistics, about the general women's happiness. I'm not sure if I quoted that correctly, but the general level of women's happiness, and it's gone consistently down. Additional SSRI drugs, all of these things, and the whole thing is incredible. It smacks of raw disobedience. They really, that's the entire thing. Is when you think about it, right? I'm going to mangle this too, but it was Aquinas. But whoever talked about natural law, right? Within each of us, we have this. We have natural law to transcend and lift ourselves to God, and at the end of life, Theos. That's a natural proclivity that we have. Well, if you discount the Christ, right? Well, lots of what nature does a poor vacuum. What's moved in? This is a religion. Right?
Yeah,
this is what it's complete with dogma, with sacraments, abortion, with and the same religious fervor that would naturally come towards worshiping God has now been applied to worshiping man-made systems. And I'll argue, if you could pick that up too, and also I'll argue that ultimately, when you divorce faith and reason, you're going to move towards Marxism almost every time.
Yeah. No, and the occult too. I think that's the other thing. I mean, fundamentally, feminism is about power and control. I mean, even look at the language, birth control, Planned Parenthood, all of that is very much trying to speak to that idea that women need to be in control. And of course, we know from Our Lady as the model of, humility and surrender. That is really the ideal. And that's a very hard sell in today's culture, especially when you have had women who have been pounded with this ideology their whole life. And I know all of it, every woman I know is recovering from feminism, whether she knows it or not, and or is suffering directly from it. But the point is, and I think actually this has been helpful to men to have some kind of compassion, to be able to realize that we didn't choose this. This was really foisted upon us. All the magazines.
I've seen it my entire life.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think this is why we have to bring people's attention to it so dramatically, because of the fact that it is something that once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. But you also have to remember too, is just the amount of money that's being made off of this, like you mentioned, the antidepressant drugs, the magazines, the health stuff, all of these things are capitalizing on the fact that we hate ourselves. We hate our bodies. We hate, our behavior ends up leading to really awful consequences, and we can't figure out what that is. So we need to go to see a psychologist. All of these things are really building on each other. And this is this wasn't an accident. This is very much part of what feminism is doing. Is, again, if you break people, the more that you're going to need the government, the more you're going to need other people to deal with the mess that you've created of your life. So there's very much a focused effort to try and break women and break up the family and keep women actually from listening to the wisdom of men, or, even with my own husband, he can just cut through things like butter. Like sometimes I'll just emotionally get too far off on a tangent, and he'll just say, no, that's not right. This is right. And I'll say, of course it was right. This kind of gift that I think men have the capacity to give us is gone because we
And consequently, you know, to talk about the complementary nature, you probably stopped him from murdering one of your children.
I don't think I ever had to do that, but there absolutely is
we were there.
clarity, absolutely, that, you know, we all have gifts, but when you're functioning in a society that thinks that everybody should be in isolation, then there's no way for those gifts to actually be expressed,
Yeah.
given to the other person, and certainly given to your children. And so everybody's sort of functioning out of this place of brokenness instead of real flourishing.
Yeah. By the way, I use that example because I had a great grandfather, a really good grandfather, who explained that to me once.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he said to me like, "Oh, do you know why your dad didn't kill you just there? It was your mom. You see how that works?"
Mhm.
And I go, "No." That led to like a 15-minute conversation. I was like, "Huh." The complementary of the sexes. That's crazy. But very grace. Even in your own life, if I may, I think
Mhm.
you talked. Sometimes I get confused between your book and listening to your
Mhm.
podcast interviews. You even talked about your own experience with this growing up. You know, when you were in grad school, right?
Mhm.
And all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, yeah, like this is you overheard some conversation by some guy talking about someone who looked like a kindergarten teacher in a positive manner, right?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That was me. Yeah. No, I kept having all these boyfriends that would break up with me and then they would go marry a kindergarten teacher. And so I just couldn't figure out like what's going on here? And it was pretty amazing because as a Catholic woman, you know, I'd been going to daily mass, gosh, at that stage, probably for like 12 years, maybe even longer. I had been trying to really live out the faith and you know, the church's teachings. But if you don't have people to model to you what a woman ought to be and the way in which an ordered woman lives, then it's very difficult to sort that out. And so I was just following what the culture said. You know, I was trying to be ambitious and outspoken and, you know, all these things that didn't quite feel right, but that's what I was told to do. And I think that was really what was the problem. And so I ended up just starting to pay attention. You know, what do men say when they don't know you're listening? And at one point I heard someone say, you know, this woman she's really sweet. And I thought, I have no idea what that means. You know, it was really an eye-opening thing. And you read it in lyrics of music and poetry, and you know, men have certain things in which they like about women, and it's never, you know, the bitter, nagging woman in the pantsuit. You know, like that's not the model. And so, anyway, I think that was just an incredible lesson. And you know, eventually, I ended up a year later. I really spent a lot of time just sort of thinking this through and what kind of people did I want in my life? What kind of
Sure.
person did I want to be? And about a year later, I was walking in the metro in DC, and a young man came up to me and said, "Are you a school teacher?" And so I knew that I finally gotten to that point.
Sure.
But it's still a struggle for me. I mean, my husband will tell you, you know, very easily that it's still a struggle for me to sort of figure out what, you know, what this balance is, and um, how does this work? And I think this is, you know, we're in that kind of messy place in the culture because we've got things like trad wives who are sort of supposed to be modeling things, but they don't always quite have it right because things
Great example. Right.
over sexualized in a lot of ways too. And so it's just this effort, I think, which is great. I applaud it in the with respect to the fact that we're moving away from this sort of girl boss era where everybody just thinks she's got to, you know, be the girl boss with no children, and that's what going to be her life. And moving more towards you know, getting back to this idea of what the family looks like. But that's the hard part because, you know, we're in what, generation 3 or 4.
Yes.
And so all the people that would have been our models have long passed away. And so it's hard to sort of figure out how does this work, especially in today's culture, and, you know, doing it in a beautiful and healthy and compelling way. And so I'm always encouraging young women, you know, find those women that you think are wise, that you like the way they engage with their husbands, the way they manage their children, and just pay attention and listen, because I think those are going to be the best examples, and they're hard to find. I will tell you that they're very hard to find, but when you find, you can kind of even
a big part of it. A big part of it too is you know, and call it Saul Alinsky tactics.
Mhm.
Everything is a binary imperative, right?
Yes.
So if for example you wanted to raise your children and homeschool them,
Mhm.
you're a what's with that red bonnet? What is that?
Oh, your Handmaid's Tale. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And so the binary nature of this,
Mhm.
and like none of this is, you know, this does not mean the hierarchy of the family that we're talking about. This is not domestic servitude. That's not what this is about. You know what I mean? And I think they've reduced it to that ridiculous binary model, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
no, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's, I think, the real challenge is that they've defined themselves, but they've also defined us, what they think those of us who homeschool our children, have more than 1.3, what we're supposed to look like. And so I think that's the real challenge, is sort of trying to sort that out and figure out how do we live this when we don't want anything to do with The Handmaid's Tale. We're not part of some sort of fertility cult, but we actually really love the wisdom of the church, and we love our husbands, and we love our children, and we want to be the best women that we can be. And it's hard to do that when it's seemingly you've got two really bad choices, but that's the beauty, is that there's something so much more beautiful than what those two pieces and options are in the world.
Oh wow, well said. If we could move a little bit, because I was really jarred by this. I don't think we have to. I could find it, but the litany from the Women's Ecology in Greenwich Village.
Yeah.
But I say that because I honestly believe that to be very honest and very accurate.
Yeah. Yeah. So the litany is, I don't have it memorized, although I ought to at this point, but it's by Kate Millett. And this was one of the major things during the second wave of feminism, was this idea of consciousness raising, which actually, again, came from the socialists back in the 1890s. Used all over the place, all over communist Russia, all over China, Red China. And that's what the women in Greenwich Village thought they were doing, was, sort of this red Chinese tactic, communist tactic of consciousness raising. Basically, all it does is sort of gets everybody worked up into this emotional frenzy of resentment about everything in their lives. Or if it's not their life, then it's somebody else's life. They're angry about what happened in somebody else's life. And it just stirs up this kind of resentment, and they call it consciousness raising. Well, Kate Millett and her friends.
Mao Zedong did that, right? Or did you say that already?
Yeah. Yeah, it was used by him, but it was absolutely a much earlier tactic than that. This gospel of discontent is actually what I've called it in an article I wrote for the American Spectator. And so that's what they're doing, is trying to stir the emotions of women, because they know it's just incredibly effective to get women on their team that are really angry and bitter. And so Kate Millett, she's with a bunch of her friends in Greenwich Village. I want to say it was like 1970, 72. They have this, what we'd call litany, and Millett was Catholic, so she would have known what a litany was. But her sister Mallory is the one that's been, was there and has been telling the world really the truth about Kate Millett. But in the litany, they go back and forth with Kate saying something and then the group following. And basically the idea is, how do we destroy the family? How do we read it? How do we destroy the patriarchy? How do we get rid of all of these elements? And it's through basic things like promoting homosexuality, prostitution, abortion. Those are the major things. And this is in 1970, when these things are not all over the place at this point. But this is what they really wanted to promote, because they knew this would take away the authority of men, because they knew men couldn't control the family when all of these things were happening under their roof, or outside of their roofs, and just really destroy the family. So it's a fascinating piece of American history, largely because of the fact that they were so successful with it. And I think this is one of the amazing things, is just, if you look back at that litany in the 1970s, all of it's come to pass.
Yeah. Would you mind if I read it? I found it.
Oh, absolutely. I didn't know you had it. Yeah. Please.
And I just found it. And the point is, because it was so jarring and so, to your point, so accurate. I'll just take a second.
No, by all means.
All right. And the litany went like this. Why are we here today? The chairwoman asked. To make revolution, they answered. What kind of revolution? She replied. The cultural revolution, they chanted. And how do we make cultural revolution? She demanded. By destroying the American family, they answered. How do we destroy the family? She came back. By destroying the American patriarch, they cried exuberantly. And how do we destroy the American patriarch? She probed. By taking away the power. And how do we do that? By destroying monogamy, they shouted. And how can we destroy monogamy? By promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, abortion, and homosexuality. They all resounded.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah. That when I read that, and matter of fact, the first time I read that was in an article you wrote for, I didn't get the publication, but and when I was doing research for this, and I was really chilled by that.
Yeah.
Because it's completely accurate. Again, this is about deconstruction. We're in a period of deconstruction. No one stopped to ask what this is going to look like on the other side. You know, we don't have things like mom and dad, kind of central to, you know, both formation. Look at the, and you know, and think about also, if you could just pick it up from here, but just one last point. The whole concept here too is redistribution of wealth to have the government step in. That's imperative. We saw it, unfortunately, in the African-American community. Get rid of the fathers. Right? They're pretty strong. You know, you read Thomas Sowell. And, you know, Thomas Sowell talks about this brilliantly. They were on their way up, you know, prior to the Great Society and LBJ. And he had, I mean, he really wrote about this eloquently. So you get rid of a traditional strong presence in the house. You have the African-American man, and you have the government step in. And what happened? You know, 80% out of wedlock births, crime rate, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But you could talk a little, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the best example of this is that, remember back with Obama administration, the Julia character that they came up with.
Yes.
She was this woman that from birth until her death was taken care of by the government. This was a goal. You know, this was something that they were celebrating, was that Julia didn't need a man. She didn't need any, you know, in these family. She didn't need church. She just needed the government. The government was going to take care of everything for her. So that has in so many respects become the model. And I've spent a lot of time speaking with a woman who runs a shelter for women who are pregnant, and it's an amazing organization called Mary's Shelter in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Kathleen Wilson runs it. I write about her a lot and have written about her a lot in my books. But one of the things that she says, especially among these women who are incredibly poor and without resources, is that they don't look to marriage as some kind of an option. It's something that's a luxury now, that they she's heard them say things like, the women say things like, oh, well, she's the kind of woman that could get married. It has become this luxury instead of a reality. And so it's not even really on their radar to be thinking, oh, maybe I should cultivate this long-term relationship with the fathers of my children. So it's incredibly devastating, I think, particularly to the poor. And, we're obviously, a lot of times focused on middle-class women, upper-class women who have the means to withstand this, but it's been absolutely devastating. And I talk about this in the book, this idea of bureaugamy, where women are no longer married to men, but they are married to the government. And I'd love to take credit for that title. It's from a man named Lionel Tiger, who actually came up with the term male bonding. He's really prolific and interesting sociologist. But in any event, I think that's really fundamentally what we have gotten to, is where women see themselves, married to the government, not in a literal way, but that's who's providing for their children is the government. So yeah, it's become incredibly messy, and what we're doing. And then we're also seeing, obviously, the layers and layers of damage that's happening to all these generations of children who don't know what it means to be mothered. They don't know what it means to have a father, or even siblings. In a lot of cases, I lived in Italy for a while, and that was the amazing thing to see, was just how, slim the families become. And then, all of this is sort of supposed to look really amazing. And then you get women who, they get into their 40s, 50s, 60s, and they realize, my parents have died. I have no siblings. I didn't get married, or I'm divorced. I didn't have children. You're kind of in a position where you're stuck. And, I've talked to enough of those women that you can just see, like, that's the bitterness, because then there's no going back. Then there's, it's very difficult to change the situation when you have gotten past your point of being fertile. It's very hard to change. And of course, God makes straight lines with crooked lives, all the time. And is doing some amazing things with these women. But how many women are out there that don't know that, and aren't hearing the message of God, and aren't hearing, that their lives still have this incredible richness and potential to give to others, because we haven't been taught how to give to others as we grow up. So anyway, yeah, it's just a really large mess, no matter how you start tackling it. It feels like, you're going to run into something really messy because of the brokenness of the family and the faith.
100%. I'll tell you, I think we're coming to a kind of a close here. Yeah, almost. We're almost wrapping this up. If I could, I just wanted to really get across. I'm going to put it in the show notes. I really think it'd be worth your time to buy Dr. Carrie Gress's book. It profoundly affected me. It really did. And I'll put it in the show notes. And also, do you have any closing remarks, Carrie?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would just say, I think the fundamental problem in the culture today is what we have done to women. And I think it's been by design. And I think if we can start helping women realize, I mean, it's that cliche, what's become cliche now. We don't even know what a woman is. And that's really been divorced from this idea of motherhood, which has absolutely been, it's been by design, to try and separate women from motherhood. And I don't even mean biological motherhood alone. I think psychological motherhood in terms of mentoring others and helping others, and spiritual motherhood that, especially the nuns that I know, this incredible gift that they give me as, I have one group of nuns that I call the mothers who mother mothers, because they have helped me so much spiritually throughout the years as I'm trying to mother my own children. But I think if we can get back to that concept and stop treating it like it's some sort of taboo or even just like a lifestyle option, but that's something very fundamental to women. I think that's really where we start getting back on course again, because fundamentally it shifts away from us, the focus on us, because that's what feminism does, is it makes us prioritize ourselves over others. And if you can get it back, the vision back to what it means to love and serve others, then suddenly it all changes. And it's not just in the family, it's in the workplace, it's in our schools. That dynamic changes. Women know what it is that they're meant to do with their lives. And it serves them throughout all of it. So anyway, I think that's, the very simple answer. And I think that's exciting because it doesn't have to be that complicated, but it's challenging in the culture in which we live, because it's been so maligned and beat up. And, we haven't said a good thing about motherhood in 50 years.
Wow, yeah, right.
But it means that it's time to say it in a fresh and beautiful way. And that's, what I'm doing with my work at Theology of Home, is trying to really give people the intellectual hooks to be able to understand what it means to be a woman today in a compelling and rich way, instead of, the handmaid's way.
Sure. And on that note, we'll leave it there. But I just want to add one more thing. I think you wrap that up beautifully, because I remember you made that point in the book actually about the nuns. But the worst part about all this is people have been indoctrinated, particularly young women. I've seen it in my daughter, I've seen it in friends, and they've been indoctrinated. And the worst tragedy of all this is, paradoxically, by giving you receive. A family is the most probably the closest representation of heaven on earth there is, when done correctly. And yet it's been so polluted by selfishness and egocentrism. And that's smacked throughout your book. That point really grabbed me. You know what I mean? Like when you talked about the wreckage that was left behind, and and you always you always counterbalance your points with the beauty of what could be. If I may compliment you on that.
Well, thank you.
But anyway, Carrie Gress, or Dr. Carrie Gress, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, guys, buy her book. And the other thing is, pass this message along. People need to hear this, particularly young women and young guys, at least I'm going to do my best. But Doctor, thank you again, Carrie, and really enjoyed having you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Jim.
Great. This is Jim Maughan from the Lepanto Institute. This is your anchor team closing out, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.